Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program, presented in conjunction with our current special exhibition, Courage and Compassion, the Japanese-American World War II Experience, created by the Go for Broke Education Center. We had really hoped to be with many of you in person tonight, but the weather didn't cooperate. So thank you for joining us virtually. I hope you're all at home, safe and warm, and I also hope that we get to see you in person very soon. I'd like to start by thanking our wonderful sponsors for this exhibition, which is supported by Texas Instruments, the Carl B. and Florence E. King Foundation, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. And our exhibition sponsors are Orchid Giving Circle and Toyota. We're so grateful for your generous support. I'd also like to thank our community partners for this exhibition: Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Lone Star, Dallas Jewish Historical Society, Legacy Senior Communities, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. We are grateful for your support of the mission and this important exhibition. And as always, I'd like to give a shout out to our museum members and our board members joining us tonight. We couldn't put on programs like this without the support of our members. And for those of you joining who aren't members, I hope you'll consider going to our website, dhhrm.org, and becoming a member. When you do that, you can come see this wonderful special exhibition as many times as you'd like, as well as seeing our permanent exhibition and our programs in the Cinemark Theater and the Dimensions and Testimony Theater. And now it is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Mitchell T. Maki. Dr. Maki is the president and CEO of Go for Broke National Education Center, a nonprofit organization committed to maintaining and contemporarily applying the legacy of World War II Nisei veterans. He's nationally recognized as a leader in the Japanese American community and is the lead author of the award-winning book, Achieving the Impossible Dream: How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress, a detailed case study of the passage of the 1988 Civil Liberties Act. Mitch is an active member of the Japanese American community and has served on the Board of Governors and scholarly advisory councils of the Japanese American National Museum and Go for Broke National Education Center. We'll have time for questions at the end of tonight's program, so please use your Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. And now, it is my pleasure to welcome Mitch Mackey.
Thank you, Mary Pat, for that very kind introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm so delighted to be with you all tonight. As was mentioned, I'm Mitch Mackey, president of Go for Broke National Education Center, and we are a nonprofit organization which tells the story of the Japanese American soldiers of World War II, of their courage, their valor, and their sacrifice as they upheld America's promise. The promise that in our nation, no one is to be judged by the color of their skin, the nation of their origin, or the religion which they choose to keep. I'd like to start off by thanking the leadership and staff of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and in particular, Mary Pat Higgins, for bringing courage and compassion to Dallas, Texas. Additionally, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the event, Texas Instruments, the Carl B. and Florence E. King Foundation, the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission, Orchid Giving Circle, and of course, our friends at Toyota. And also a shout out to the community partners, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Lone Star, the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, Legacy Senior Communities, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. Thank you for your support and belief that we must never forget, but rather learn from the tragedies and mistakes of the past. You know, as I thought about what I wanted to share here tonight, I couldn't help but think of my grandmother, and I'd like to start off my comments with a story about her. You see, if there's any word that would describe the life of my grandmother, that word would be hard. She came to America as a young girl, worked on the plantations on Hawaii, got married at a young age, and by the time she was 30, she had 6 children. My grandmother never lived much above the poverty line. And so whatever hopes and dreams she had for a better tomorrow rested squarely on the shoulders of her children and of her grandchildren. Now, my grandmother didn't speak much English, and I don't speak much Japanese. In fact, my favorite memory of her is of her chasing me around the house yelling, "Bakatare, bakatare." For those of you who don't know that word, it means you stupid idiot, you stupid idiot. But I used to hear that term so often as a child, I thought it was a term of endearment. But just because my grandmother couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Japanese didn't mean that we couldn't communicate, because we had my mother and she would translate. And the message was always the same. Be good. Take care of family. Remember who you are. Remember who you are. And I believe that is why many of us have gathered here tonight. For some of us to remember who we are as Japanese Americans. For many of us to remember who we are as Americans. And for all of us to remember who we are as human beings who must learn from the past and draw courage and inspiration from those who went before us. Let me share with you the story of a small, disenfranchised ethnic community which became the victims of one of the most egregious violations of our Constitution. And yet, even in that dark moment of American history, there were Americans, upstanders, as your museum would call them, who stepped forward to defend the rights of American citizens of Japanese ancestry. December 7th, 1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrusts the United States into World War II. Japanese Americans immediately began to wonder, what would happen to us? Would we be treated like the American citizens we were, 2/3 of whom had been born here in the United States, the other third having lived here for 30, 40, and 50 years? Or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common ancestry? Well, we got our answer 2 months later, on February 19th, 1942, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which created underpinnings by which nearly 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens by birth, would be forcibly excluded from the West Coast and made to spend the next 3 to 5 years of their lives living behind barbed wires. We lost our homes. We lost our jobs. We lost our communities. But most of all, what was lost was a sense of place at the American table of citizenship. Japanese Americans were instructed that they could only bring what they could carry. And they were loaded onto trains that would travel for days with the window shades pulled down. The young, the old. The exclusion orders made no exceptions. And while living in these camps, Japanese American families were forced to live in communal surroundings in desolate areas, surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers. No charges, no trials, no rights. And then a curious thing happened. About a year into the camp experience, the US Army, realizing that the war effort was going poorly, decided that they needed more men to go and fight in Europe. They came up with the idea of creating a segregated Japanese American unit. Imagine the angst and the anxiety as these young men, boys really, 18, 19 years of age, were asked to fight for their nation, the United States of America, put themselves in harm's way, and possibly die for liberty and justice halfway across the world, while their own families were being imprisoned behind barbed wire. The issue tore the community apart as families struggled over whether they would allow their sons to go and fight or whether they would encourage their sons to resist. At first, the decision was a voluntary one, but later it became an issue of whether to cooperate or resist the mandatory draft orders. Despite the paradoxical nature of the choice, on the first day that they could, 10,000 young Japanese Americans from the territory of Hawaii volunteered. For those on the mainland, however, and in the incarceration camps, the choice was more difficult. And on that first day, 1,200 Japanese American men volunteered, with thousands to follow. They would go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history. In Europe, they were known as the 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team. These young soldiers were awarded 8 presidential citations, 21 medals of honor, and over 4,000 Purple Hearts, the medal that you receive when you're either wounded or killed. A few years ago, my daughter and I were fortunate enough to visit the forest outside of a small town in northern France called Bruyères. It was here that the famous battle of the rescue of the Lost Battalion took place. October 1944. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Division was surrounded by 6,000 Nazi troops in the French forest. The Lost Battalion, as it became known, was a Texas National Guard unit with approximately 270 white American soldiers. The Army had sent in several battalions to try and rescue them, but no one could break through the Nazi line. The 100th 442nd had just finished a week of fierce combat in liberating the towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine. Rather than being given the required time to recover, they were given the task of rescuing the Lost Battalion. The Japanese American soldiers knew that this was a suicide mission, but they also knew that the eyes of a nation were upon them. The 100th 442nd broke through the Nazi defenses and rescued 211 white American soldiers, many of whom were from Texas, and in the process took over 300 casualties in the battle. But that was the math of the day. Among those Japanese American soldiers that day was a young man named Sergeant George Otzka. After the war, Sergeant Otzka relocated to Houston, Texas, to live with his family. He attempted to purchase land, but was told, quote, "Keep away or there would be trouble," unquote. In response, Otzka wrote a letter to the Houston Chronicle, to the Houston Press, quote, "What I would like to know, is that your answer to rescuing the Lost Battalion in the Vosges Mountains of France? Is that your answer for the terrific casualties we suffered to rescue those men of the 36th? Is that your answer to my buddies who will never come back and who fortunately won't feel the sting of prejudice?" Unquote. In response, there was an outpouring of support from the Houston community. The Houston chapter of the American Veterans Committee stated, quote, "Either Texans must uphold the principles of democracy at home, or our boys have died in vain," unquote. George Otzka received many offers of land and eventually purchased a farm northeast of Houston. Americans, Texans, upstanders, doing the right thing in a time of crisis. Another story, which is hard to fathom, is the liberation of Lithuanian Jews from the Nazi concentration camps. Toward the end of the war, the US Army began to chase the Nazi troops back into Germany. The artillery unit of the 442nd joined in that effort. The artillery unit came upon a large installation, and as they approached it, they saw large lumps on the ground covered with snow. The Japanese American soldiers initially thought they were logs, but they soon discovered that they were not logs, but that in fact they were the bodies of Jewish prisoners of a satellite of Dachau concentration camp. The Japanese American soldiers flung open the gates and freed the Jewish inmates. Imagine the irony as these young men liberated Jews from a concentration camp halfway around the world, while their own families remained behind barbed wire. In the Pacific theater, Japanese Americans also served as interrogators, intelligence officers, and linguistic experts, and were credited with helping to end the war in the Pacific years earlier than otherwise would have happened. They participated in every major battle and campaign against Japan. MIS soldiers served as undercover agents in the Philippines, fought behind enemy lines with Merrill's marauders in Burma, experienced jungle warfare in New Guinea. They landed with the Marines on the beaches of Iwo Jima and crawled into caves of Saipan to persuade suicidal enemy forces to surrender. Many Japanese Americans participated as translators and interpreters in the prosecution of the Japanese officials in the war trials that began in December 1945 and lasted until 1948. They also played a critical role in the composition of the new Japanese Constitution that would help guide post-war Japan into the modern era. Why? Why did these young men choose to serve? Why did they choose to put themselves in harm's way, knowing that their own families were deprived of their civil liberties? The best answer comes from a young sergeant named Kazuo Masuda. His answer was the answer that many of these young Japanese American soldiers would have given. When asked why he was doing this, his response was, because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America. Right or wrong, agree with him or not, Sergeant Masuda and the thousands of other Japanese American soldiers understood that in 1943, 1944, and 1945, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. 1945 comes, and with it, the end of the war, and the camps begin to close. Japanese Americans are given $25 and a one-way train ticket to go and reestablish their lives. On the top of their list was, let's get a job. Let's find a place to live. Let's put food on the table. Let's send our kids back to school. Let's rebuild our communities. But there was another feeling, a feeling of shame. A feeling that somehow we had done something wrong to bring this egregious violation upon ourselves. And the best analogy that I can give you is that of a sexual assault victim or an incest survivor who, through no fault of their own, have had a terrible thing happen to them, and they blame themselves. If only I had done this, if only I had done that, if only I had said this, if only, if only, if only. And that's how the Japanese American community felt. If only we had been more American, this would never have happened to us. And Japanese Americans felt that they needed to be 110% American so that this tragedy would never happen again. The 1950s come, and with it, the beginning of change in America. 1952, We have the McCarran-Walters Act, which allows Japanese immigrants to naturalize for the very first time. 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education, which says that separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. The civil rights movement begins in the 50s. And then something happens in 1959, which sets the foundation by which someday the Japanese American community might be recognized by the federal government. What happens in 1959 is that Hawaii becomes a state, and with statehood comes representation. In fact, the very first representative from the now new state of Hawaii was a young man named Daniel K. Inoue. Daniel Inoue was a member of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and he lost his right arm in battle fighting for his nation. What better symbol of loyalty to send to Congress than somebody like Representative Inoue? The 60s comes along, and the 60s is a time of great change. The civil rights movement is in full bloom. The women's movement has captured the imagination of young people across the United States. The anti-war movement is teaching young people how to say, hell no, I won't go. And dissent becomes viewed as an American value. The ethnic studies movement is taking place in universities, and young people begin to look at their own histories. For young Asian Americans, Japanese Americans in particular, they looked back and said, what happened? Why did our parents and our grandparents go to these camps? Why didn't they resist? We would have resisted. And they began to look at their parents and grandparents through the lens of accommodation and cowardice. But the Japanese American community was still a long ways away from wanting to talk about, much less demand an apology for the camp experience. As an example, in 1963 at UCLA, there was a professor named Roger Daniels. And Professor Daniels had a history class, and his first assignment was for his students to write their own autobiography. He received the autobiographies from his students, and he had two young Japanese Americans in his class, and he read their autobiographies. Both of them started with, I was born in 1943 in Los Angeles, blah, 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 blah. As Professor Daniels read that, he realized there was a problem. He called the two young men into his office the next day and said, there's a problem with your autobiographies. And they both looked at him and said, we didn't cheat, Dr. Daniels. I mean, how do you cheat on an autobiography? Dr. Daniels said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Take your autobiographies home, show them to your folks, come back and see me. And sure enough, the next day, one of the young students came back and said, you're right, Dr. Daniels. I was born in 1943, but not in Los Angeles. I was born in Manzanar, an incarceration camp. The pain, the shame, the wanting to forget was so powerful for some of these families that they didn't even tell their own children the truth about the incarceration. The 1970s come into play, and with it, more representation for the Japanese Americans in the US Congress. By now, Representative Inoue is now Senator Dan Inoue. In 1974, Norman Mineta, the mayor of San Jose, is elected to the US House of Representatives. Norm was a 10-year-old boy when he and his family were sent off to camp at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. 1976, Spark Matsunaga becomes senator from the state of Hawaii. Senator Matsunaga was also a member of the 100th Battalion and the MIS and a decorated war veteran. And in 1978, Robert Matsui was elected to the US House of Representatives from Sacramento. Robert Matsui was a 6-month-old baby when he and his family were sent off to Tule Lake. So by now, at the end of the 70s, we had 2 decorated war veterans in the Senate and 2 former inmates of American incarceration camps in the US House of Representatives. But the community was still split as to how it felt about pursuing redress. And basically, there were three trains of thought. The first said, let it go. It happened a long time ago. We're doing much better. We don't want to have to remember the pain. We don't want to have to tell those stories. Don't make me feel those feelings again. And it was primarily the elderly who felt this way. The second group said, no, what was done to us was wrong, and we are deserving of a good, clean apology. Don't give us money, just give us a good, clean apology. Part of that was very pragmatic because the nation had never apologized nor provided redress to any particular group. So let's get what we could get and not try to overreach. But there was also a very principled reason. Don't insult me. Don't take away my constitutional rights. Throw a few dollars at me and say everything is now okay. Don't put a price tag on my civil liberties. Just give me a good, clean apology. The final group said, hey, wait a second. Yes, we are deserving of an apology, but we are also deserving of monetary redress. There were real losses. People lost their homes, people lost their jobs, people lost their businesses. It wasn't as if they called us names and hurt our feelings. Give us an apology and give us money with that apology so that we know that this is an authentic and legitimate atonement. The debate between these three trains of thought tore the community apart through the 70s until finally, in 1978, the Japanese American Citizens League, the largest Japanese American civil rights organization, passed its most strongly worded resolution, which said, we demand a presidential apology. And along with that apology, we want monetary reparations in the form of individual payments and community payments. Over the next 10 years, the community would engage in a battle to make the story of the Japanese American incarceration one that American legislators would understand. It started with a commission hearing, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in the early 80s. The commission traveled to 10 cities and heard testimony from over 750 individuals, those who had been held in the camps and those who designed them. It was not easy to get people to testify. In San Jose, a friend of mine, Richard Katsuda, was working with the elderly, and he told them, go to San Francisco, testify at the hearings. But the elderly refused. To them, going before a federal commission and telling their painful stories was like going before the pearly gates of heaven and telling God that he gave them a bad life. It was too intimidating. But Richard persisted. If not for yourself, then koromo no tame ni, for the sake of your children and your grandchildren, go and tell your story. 6 individuals agreed. And on the van ride to San Francisco, you could hear a pin drop in the van as they were all petrified over what they were about to do. They went to the hearings and they testified before the commission. And on the way home, all you could hear in the van was laughter, singing, and them slapping each other on the back as they had begun to face their demons. In Los Angeles, there was a gentleman who testified named Kiyoshi Sonoda. Dr. Sonoda was a dentist, and he testified that because he had some medical training, he was put in charge of the infirmary. He described his first patient, a young, dehydrated infant. And he said, under normal circumstances, with the proper supplies, he would have been able to make that infant well. but because he didn't have the proper supplies or equipment. All he could do was hold that infant in his hands and feel his last twitch before he died. And as Dr. Sonoda told this story, he had tears streaming down his face. And in the audience, his wife was watching and she softly said, "Kiyoshi is crying." Kiyoshi doesn't cry. Kiyoshi didn't even cry at his own father's funeral. But on that day, Dr. Sonoda did cry, and a community cried with him. And as powerful as these testimonies were, I will submit to you that the more powerful testimonies occurred in people's dining rooms and living rooms, as young Japanese Americans asked their parents and their grandparents to finally tell them what really happened during World War II. And their parents and grandparents would begin to tell their stories, some for the very first time. And the parents would ask, "Can we really get an apology?" And the answer was, "We don't know, but we have to try." The commission issued its findings in a report, Personal Justice Denied. It found that the camps were wrong and a result of, quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, unquote. The commission supported the idea of an apology and monetary reparations. Then the battle migrated to the Congress, to the halls of the US House of Representatives and the US Senate. Finally, on September 17th, 1987, the bill hits the floor of the House of Representatives. This day was chosen specifically as it was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. And on that day, the impossible dream of obtaining an apology and monetary redress payments from the nation passed the House of Representatives. 243 representatives voted for this unprecedented bill. 180 of them were Democrats, 63 of them were Republicans. It was truly a bipartisan effort. 7 months later, the bill hits the floor of the Senate, and we knew it would pass because Senator Matsunaga had personally lobbied every one of the other 99 US senators. And by the time it hit the floor of the Senate, there were 71 co-sponsors. So now we just needed one more supporter, one more signature. And of course, that would be the President of the United States. And for those of you who remember 1988, the president was none other than Ronald Reagan, a very conservative president whose own administration had been fighting against this bill, both in the Congress as well as in the courts. Many of us, myself included, thought there was no way on God's green earth that Ronald Reagan would sign this bill. But for those of you who remember Ronald Reagan, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. He had the ability to tell stories that would move people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. Well, the opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands. The question was, what story could we tell President Reagan that would help him to understand on a very personal level the significance of this bill? Well, remember I told you of a young Japanese American soldier named Kazuo Masuda? He was the one who said he was fighting because it was the only way that he knew that his family could have a chance in America. 2 weeks after saying that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle, fighting for his nation, the United States of America. After the war, his family wants to move back to Santa Ana, California, but they're met with racial taunts, hate speech, and threats of bodily harm. The Army, realizing that this is a PR fiasco, that the family of one of its own heroes can't move back home, sends out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family. Later that day, at a United America rally, there was a young white American captain who addressed the audience. His name was Ronald Reagan. Captain Reagan addressed the audience by saying, "The blood that is soaked into the sands is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only nation not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family to another, for what your son Kazuo did, thanks." That story was relayed to President Reagan in the 1980s, and his response was that he remembered what those soldiers did for America. On August 10th, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, providing a presidential apology, $20,000 in individual monetary reparations, and a $50 million trust fund for all those affected by Executive Order 9066. It was a very proud moment, not just for Japanese Americans, but for all Americans who treasure and cherish the Constitution and the values of our nation. Now, as I leave you here today, lest we feel that justice has been permanently secured, let me leave you with the words of the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Before his death, Justice Scalia stated, "What happened to the Japanese Americans was wrong, but you are kidding yourself if you think it will never happen again. In times of war, the laws fall silent. In times of war, the laws fall silent." Very chilling words for all of us who cherish the Constitution and the liberties which it provides to us all. So as we end here today, I hope you will join me in committing ourselves to never again allowing in our nation, our laws to fall silent. May we always find the courage and compassion as Americans and simply as human beings to protect and preserve our most cherished values. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for that incredible presentation. I'm happy to say we have plenty of time for questions and answers as well. So again, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. But we'll start with this one. And I know because we're virtual tonight, probably many people watching tonight haven't had a chance to see the exhibit. We hope you will come. We're here through June 12th with it. But could you talk a little bit about how this exhibition came together? What inspired Go for Broke to create it, and how did all the pieces come together?
Well, about 5 years ago, we applied for and received a grant to create Courage and Compassion, which would be a traveling exhibit going across the nation and telling the story of World War II and what happened to Japanese Americans. But quite frankly, that's been done before by other groups and so forth. What made our exhibit different and I think very special is that the last part of the exhibit, possibly the last 20, 25% of the exhibit, told the local story of people in the local community who stood up and protected the rights of Japanese Americans. Just like the story that I shared in my comments about George Otzka and the local people in Houston standing up and saying he is an American and he deserves to buy land and he deserves to settle down here. It's a tremendous testament to Americans and those living in America doing the right thing in a time of crisis. Now, the truth is, those stories are few and far between, that it's much easier to find the stories of racism and prejudice and discrimination. But I think especially in this day and age and right now where we are as a nation, the message is very clear. We as Americans can do the right things in crisis. We can stand together, find our common ground, and live up to the greatest promise of our nation. And as I mentioned, that promise is that no one is to be judged by the color of their skin, the nation of their origin, or the religion which they choose to keep. And I think these stories begin to tell that story to people across the nation. And we've gone to over 12 cities, some as far west as Honolulu, Hawaii, certainly on the West Coast, but we've been to Minnesota, been to Ohio, and we've been to a number of different cities, even here in Texas. And because of the 442nd's connection with Texas through the story of the Lost Battalion, we've received so much support in your fine state. So thank you.
Well, we're happy to support it. And one of my favorite parts of the exhibit, which actually is a separate exhibition that you all generously sent along with Courage and Compassion, is called Portraits of Courage. And it's photographs of Japanese American veterans as they are now. And I think you mentioned over the last 10 years or so, these photos have been taken. What was that project like? What was it like to identify these veterans and to have them sit for these incredible photographs?
So yes, I would encourage all of your visitor or everyone on this call to please go and see these photographs. They're done by a very gifted photographer named Shane Sato. And what he did is he went and found these Japanese American veterans in their 80s and 90s, had them dress up in their uniforms or facsimiles of their uniforms, and he really captured their spirit. And I think it's hard to put it into words. It's one of those things where a photo is worth 1,000 words. And you
Right.
see these men who are 80, 90 years old, but their spirit comes through in these photographs. And then as you know their story, as you start to piece it together that, for some of them 60, 70 years earlier, they had been fighting either in Europe or in the Pacific, despite being treated as less than American, being doubted and being treated like the enemy. And it's even more special for those of us who know these individuals as people, as men, to see their spirits come out, because some of these guys are singing, some of these guys are laughing, some of them are looking serious and tough, and it's all their personalities that are captured.
And let me ask you, obviously, for us as the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, the connection is so clear to us. In our Pivot to America wing, which talks about American human and civil rights, we cover this era and the rights of Asian Americans and the struggle for that across the course of our history. But for you all, what interested you in working with the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum to bring in an exhibit like this?
Annie, is that a rhetorical question? Do you really expect the answer? I mean, to us, it's also so very, very clear. We've actually had this exhibit come twice before into Texas, but we wanted to bring it back to your museum, to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, because we feel that our stories are so connected, and that we're kindred spirits in many ways. And we both talk about tragedies that should never happen again. But we not only do it from a historical point of view, but we try and make it relevant to issues today that we as Americans need to struggle to find that common ground that we all share. And, I think it's no secret in the United States right now that we're facing a crisis, a political crisis. There's so much divisiveness. In Washington, D.C., everything breaks down along partisan lines. And my personal belief is that's not political leadership, that's political divisiveness. And I think we as Americans need to look for that common ground, that sense of what makes our nation special, and I think that begins with understanding the human experience that your museum talks a great deal about, and hopefully our traveling exhibit also brings to light.
And let me ask you, you talked about the role of Japanese American soldiers in the Pacific. Are there any records of how, and I'm not sure the best way to phrase this question, but are there any records about how those, especially the Nisei soldiers, felt fighting a war in the Pacific against the country of their parents' origin. I mean, do we know anything about what that felt like for them?
You know, there were thousands of young Japanese American men and women that served in the Pacific, right? And what that means to me is that there are thousands of different stories. So, and for each one of them, there's a different story. But I can tell you that some of the common themes were there were some who had family members, literally brothers or cousins that they knew would be in the Imperial Army for Japan. And there was a little bit of angst and concern. What would happen if I had to face my cousin? What would happen if I had to face my brother on the battlefield? But even with that concern and that angst, they knew that they had to support the nation that they were born in, which was the United States of America. And very quickly, I think this story will help to answer your question that on Saipan, it was a bloodbath, and there were MIS soldiers that were accompanying the American forces as they forced the Japanese troops northward on that small rock in the middle of the island, in the middle of the ocean. And toward the end, where the Japanese soldiers were holed up in the northern caves, and there's one story of a veteran named Bob Kubo, and he was an MIS interpreter and translator. And his unit had cornered 8 Japanese soldiers in a cave, but they also held over 100 Japanese hostages, civilians. Bob Kubo looked around at his fellow soldiers and he said, they were boys. They were 18, 19-year-old boys, and these were mostly white Americans. And he said to his captain, too many of them have died. I'm going into that cave and I'm going to talk them out. And even his captain said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. He said, it's something we have to do, because Bob Kubo understood that he was an American and he was going in there to make sure that none of his American fellow soldiers would die anymore. He went in there and immediately was surrounded by the 8 Japanese soldiers. And he began to speak to them in Japanese, and they began to have a dialogue and so forth. And they questioned him. They said, how can you be fighting for America? You're Japanese. And he cited to them an ancient Japanese story of a young samurai who had to choose between serving his father or serving his nation. And Bob Kubo said, yes, I am born of a Japanese father who has come to America, but I was born in America, and America is my country. And when he said that to the Japanese soldiers, they even understood that this young man was serving his nation in an honorable way. And as the story goes, they even bowed to him, right, at that point. He then says to them, send out the civilians. There's no sense in killing them. And they said, okay, you can leave now and let us decide what we're going to do. We will either release them at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or we will kill them all at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So Bob left the cave and they anxiously waited. And sure enough, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they started to see people exiting the cave. The soldiers released the civilians. And not only did they release the civilians, they joined the civilians, laid down their arms and walked out. So, again, there are numerous stories about this. And certainly there was some angst on the part of some of these individuals. What does it mean if I see a fellow family member on the other side? But in their heart of hearts, in the Pacific theater, as well as in the European theater, these young men knew who they were. As I talked about earlier, what my grandmother said, remember who you are. They knew who they were. They were Americans.
Wow, what an incredible story. Another question we have, one of our audience members says, I was actually going to ask if women also served, and you just mentioned that they did. Are there any stories about female veterans you've come across that stand out to you?
The female veteran experience was a little bit different. First, because they didn't serve in fully segregated units. The women served either as WACs, Women Army Corps, or as Army Nurse Cadets. And there are some humorous stories, such as when they would go through training as WACs or Army Nurse Cadets, even the smallest size uniforms wouldn't fit them. So they would have to tailor them down even more so. But these women really showed tremendous fortitude as they were sent to different places, mostly stateside during the war. And then after the war, they were sent to occupied Japan if they could speak Japanese to help in the translation and in the assimilation of Japan to a post-war status. Um, and many of them were in units where they were the only Japanese American. And so they had to face two issues: one, serving in the military, and two, also having to face the racism that some of their non-Japanese American comrades would hold, and yet they did so with tremendous grace and amassed a very decorated record also. And I think, President Truman, after the war, greeted the 100th 442nd on the White House lawn. And he said to them all, you fought two enemies, you fought racism and you fought the enemy, and you have won. And I think that's the battle that many of the Nisei soldiers understood, that yes, they were fighting the Nazis and the Italians in Europe, and yes, they were fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, but they were also fighting a larger battle, which was the racism that their families faced at home.
Actually, that's a good thread to pick up on. One question that we have, you talked a little bit about kind of moving into the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement, the ethnic studies movement on college campuses, especially with the addition of ethnic studies courses on campuses. How did the rest of the country react to that? I mean, we know there was quite a bit of strife around the civil rights movement. I mean, were they still facing just a straight uphill battle, or were things starting to change at that time?
Well, as I mentioned, the 60s was a great time of change, and certainly with the Asian American courses that were starting to take place in the universities, as well as the other ethnicities, young people got to learn and hear about things that they had never experienced before, or never even got to hear from their own families. So it was a huge awakening for a lot of young Asian Americans, but really for a lot of young people of all colors, and including the young women at the time with the women's movement. So it really was a sense of empowerment. Was there racism at that time? Was there still a sense that, this isn't important? Yes. I think that's pretty self-evident, that on one hand, there was an awakening, but it also was at a time when there was a lot of turmoil in our nation.
We have a question actually from one of our local Holocaust survivors who's watching tonight, who himself was highly decorated. He served in the Korean War for the U.S. and he's, oh, go ahead.
Well, go ahead.
And he's just asking if either in your center or in your educational resources, have you highlighted the tremendous courage of Nisei soldiers in the Korean War? He's wondering.
Well, first of all, let me say to the caller, or thank you for your service. And, regardless of the conflict, we at Go for Broke National Education Center hold our veterans in very high esteem, because as we oftentimes say, okage-sama de, because of them, we are. And that's not only true for the veterans of World War II, but the veterans of all the different conflicts. In answer to his question, however, we primarily focus on the World War II experience, just because that's where our resources can take us. However, there are times when we spill over into talking about the experiences of the Korean War veterans, because in many times, the Korean War veterans were the younger brothers or the younger cousins of those who fought during World War II. And in fact, my father was a veteran from the Korean War, because he was just young. He was too young to go to World War II, but in the right age to be in the Korean War. And we hear that story a great deal, right? And of course, there's the story of Hershey Miyamura, who was a Japanese American soldier. He fought in World War II, but he also continued to serve during the Korean War and received the Medal of Honor. So he was the first Japanese American during the Korean War to receive the Medal of Honor.
And talking about the veterans you work with, are there still veterans that you work with who go out and speak either to school groups or to other groups about their personal experiences?
Yes, they are. There are. And in fact, I've been in my position for 5 years, going on 6 years. And that really is the very, very best part of my job, is getting to know these men, not as heroes, not as icons, and they are, certainly, and I hold them in the highest esteem, but to know them as individuals, to know them as men. And so when I think of Yosh and Tok, and we have a veteran named Fernando Sosa Masuda, who is half Japanese, half Mexican American. And unfortunately, only a handful of them are still well enough and sharp enough to go on tour, if you will, to go to schools, to go to speaking engagements. I'm hoping, as I talked to Mary Pat earlier this evening, that maybe we can pull something together in a few months where we can come out to Dallas and meet you all in person. And I'm hoping we could bring a veteran, because there's a couple that I have in mind that could make the trip still and would be a delight to meet and to hear their stories. And their stories range from heartwarming stories that just bring tears to your eyes, to some of these guys tell you stories that make you just break down laughing. I mean, their perspective on life, they're all 96, 97, 98 years of age.
Amazing. We have another question. Maybe it'll be a personal announcement from you. We have a guest who says, "You're such an orator. Would you consider a political office?" She's ready to vote for you.
At this point, no. But, and I say that because at one point I did consider a career, and for personal reasons I chose not to pursue that. But if there are any young people out there, because in my mind, politics is a young person's sport, if you're going to really make an impact, please consider it. What we need are individuals who will go to Washington, D.C., or any office, state, local, and so forth, but bringing with them a sense that we need to disagree at times. We need to see the world differently at times. But that compromise is not a dirty word. The compromise is really the foundation upon which we as a nation can move forward. And while I hope that someday we can return to that style of having Republicans and Democrats disagree, but still be able to hold hands afterwards and say, we are all Americans, that's where we need to get back to as a nation.
Hear, hear. Well, we've got a couple of great questions to end on. I'm going to make them kind of a two-part question. And one of the people asking, I just wanted to mention, his uncle was a veteran of the 442nd, a career military man, and a patriotic American. In his words, he says he's actually used your work as a resource for the book he's writing about his uncle. But really two parts to leave us today with, Mitch. How do we inspire current and future generations not to give up on this fight for American ideals, even as we're losing these incredible veterans, in our case, our Holocaust survivors, and then also how do we support the Japanese American community, the AAPI community in these times?
By supporting institutions such as the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum and Go for Broke National Education Center.
There you go.
And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but certainly there are a number of organizations like the Holocaust Museum, like our own, that tell the stories, that continue to keep these stories alive. And so, that's one place that all of us can begin, by supporting these nonprofits that do that. But even more to the point is, let's keep these stories alive. Let's figure out ways that we don't have this generational divide where one generation doesn't tell the next generation the stories, whether it's stories of the Holocaust. I mean, I can't believe that in today's age, there are still people who deny the Holocaust. I mean, that's incredibly ignorant on my part. And again, I'm showing my colors here, but, and then recently there are folks who are denying that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was wrong. And in fact, I'll share a story. We were in Kingsburg, California, one of the first stops of Courage and Compassion. And the person who was putting the exhibit together had to go to the hardware store to find extra nails and screws and whatnot. And he struck up a conversation with the clerk there. And she asked him, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he told her all about the exhibit and how it was about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And she said, "Oh, if only we could do that to the Muslims." And our poor young guy who was putting this exhibit together, it blew him away because he was just learning about it. He was inspired by the work he was doing. And he said, "I couldn't believe she said that." And I just said, "No, no, no," and walked out. Yeah. But what's important is for events like what we're doing today to continue to tell the story, to continue to have dialogue. And I'm going to just put a plug in that we really at Go for Broke National Education Center would love to come back to Dallas sometime this year, whenever we can make it work out. And we would bring some of our young people. We'd love to have them dialogue with some of your young folks. We talked about getting some students from SMU, but really, that's what we need as a nation, is true dialogue. Not that everyone has to agree, not that everyone has to see it the same way, but that we hear and listen to one another. So I guess that's the simple answers. Let's keep the dialogue going. And to everyone on this call, thank you so much for spending the time with us. And I look forward to someday meeting you all.
Well, I think that is the perfect note to end on. Thank you again, Mitch, for being with us tonight, for being so flexible with our crazy Dallas weather in February. But we do hope to bring you back in person. We'll keep everyone posted on that. But I just want to say thank you again. I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening and come see the exhibit.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Good night.